let's take a look at some data considerations in our environment. Now, data now is that new gold in the environment. It's everything that's really important. It's one of the most important assets across any organization, right? So when it comes to protecting data, there's a lot of things that we need to determine and consider, right? So things like where is the physical data located, or what law applies to that data, what classification is our data under, have we classified it essentially, right? How long should we keep or delete that data? Um, what do we need to understand? And obviously, there's some considerations around our data to ensure how we protect it. And there's four things here that we're going to cover, and then we're going to jump into looking at the different types of data that exist. We'll look at that, and then finally we'll jump into some data removal and how we sort of go around that as well. So let's look at some data consideration. The first thing here that I sort of want to highlight, and I'll talk about data sovereignty. And the reason I drew this out is because I had a really hard time spelling data sovereignty, and it's just a really tricky word. And I thought I had to spell this out before I maybe spend some time trying to spell this word out, right? So data sovereignty is all about once the data has moved to another location. And hear me out. So we're in Australia right now. And I'm filming this from Sydney, Australia. Now, if our data, if I've got a data that's here in, in Sydney, or the data is in Melbourne, and then I move that data, or then I've got maybe another data center in Hong Kong, or there's another data center in Japan, right? And as we move that data around, basically the laws of that new geolocation of where the data is will apply to that data. So basically the laws that apply to the data depending on where it's obviously physically located. So if it moves from one country to another, so if it moves from Hong Kong to Japan, well, then it will be the Japan laws that are going to govern that data. And so as they change, it's basically under the jurisdiction or under the ownership of that country. So it's something that we need to, it's something that's important, and we need to understand where our data is, where it's located, obviously at all times, because then obviously if maybe different vendors are storing our data, or we need to know where that data is at all times, right? So when we typically subscribe to cloud platforms, cloud providers, maybe there's a CRM platform that we have to connect into, or we're utilizing some sort of software as a service or a platform as a service. Well, we need to understand what country that data is going to be stored in. And yes, one is that the data is stored in Australia if we're here in Australia, but then if the part of that data is stored in the US or the UK, then there's chances are that there's different governing laws that apply to our data once it's there. And then maybe retention is maybe different and we can't get our data back. And if something occurs, it becomes quite challenging to then obtain our data as well. Because if they're doing maybe backup or doing a copy of the backups to another country or another location, well, then it's basically a replication of our data. So it'll be challenging then to obviously work with that other part of the world to then get our data back, and obviously the whole challenge of process around that. So we need to know where our data is being stored at all times, which is the whole data sovereignty piece, where as the data moves around, it could be under the jurisdiction of another location. The other component here is our data ownership, and data ownership is all about, well, who owns the data? Yes, the organization as a whole will own the data. The company then owns that data, of course, but it's typically phased out into two parts, where we have the organization's responsibility, and then we have a personal entity or someone within the organization who basically drives that initiative and becomes responsible or accountable for that data. So typically a person, so I'm just going to draw out here that it's typically the organization, I'll write org for short, and then we have a person within the org who drives that initiation, or that initiation essentially, and then they typically handle how we go about our data. So typically the person within the organization that owns the data and that's basically responsible for it. So that person who is responsible for the data will then they'll go away and do a couple of things. One, we'll just draw a couple of arrows here for three things that we're going to discuss. One is they have to classify the data. So they have to give it a tag and determine, is this sensitive? Is this private? Uh, can we hand this data to anyone? So they're going to classify the data, and we'll talk about data classification just here. So I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Um, Obviously, the assignment of backups. So we're going to obviously go away and obviously determine how we're going to do our backups. And of course, the data is going to have to be destroyed. So I'm going to write destroyed here, and we're going to look at how we securely destroy data and get rid of it and make sure that it's done correctly as well. So they're going to have to do those three sort of key things. They have to classify the data, they have to make sure that we're doing the backups correctly and it's being done, and obviously secure destruction of that data. And then the organization itself will ensure that obviously we understand, and it's important to understand who owns the data. So who will come up in the contract. So if we've got a contract, if we're using a certain provider and that such, that we come into that part of that contract discussion that we own that data. If we're using some sort of cloud vendor applications, that we have to ensure that those things are stipulated in our contract, that we own the data, even though that data is in that cloud provider's infrastructure. So I'm just going to put infra here, because if that data is stored in the infrastructure, we're going to typically say, well, we own this data. It's not part of the cloud vendor or that provider. So we're going to have to maybe review our contracts and ensure that our contracts stipulate that we own or we have the rights to our data. So that's the difference between obviously the organization component, so the organization's responsibility to ensure that they're doing their due diligence and due care with our data, ensure that it's in the contracts and things are done correctly in that nature. And then once we do that, we have to assign that to a person as well within the organization who becomes that custodian essentially, and then drives that initiative to ensure that there's data ownership across the organization. So they're the two factors here around personal and the organization, and then the different areas here that they're responsible with. So moving on here now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our classification. If I just tag this area, so we can talk about classification. So classification, typically organizations will have their own sort of naming conventions, whether it's secret, could be private, could be sensitive, and the company will typically have um, its own sort of naming convention on how they do this. Could be internal only. If it's sensitive stuff, so if it's internal, they'll have their own that, and then they'll have their own external. If we're going to be able to share these documents out, it could be public, etc. And they'll have their own obviously naming conventions for that. So the data classification component must be assigned, and then obviously the owner of that data tags and assigns classification. So we do that by then tagging and assigning that data essentially done within the actual metadata of the file. So the actual files themselves have metadata components. So we will have to go into that file and look, the ownership person doesn't have to obviously do that. We'll obviously assign that to someone that knows how to do that component, but basically you have to basically go into the actual files themselves and then classify them and mark them as such. So if we've got a bunch of confidential documents in here that are Excel files, then we've got to go into the metadata of those Excel files and then configure them and tag them appropriately to ensure it's done correctly within the actual file and the metadata of those files. So then we create the data handling procedures and our policies to how we basically deal with and handle the data with obviously these different various classifications of the data, obviously across the entire business. So that's a little bit about classification in a nutshell. And then finally, the last piece here is our retention. And this is sometimes something that's can be overlooked. It's basically how long do we basically get to keep the data? So how long, right? Is it under a specific, you know, contractual obligation? Maybe it could be legal or compliance that drive our data retention. So we need to store the data for X amount of, years, or a certain amount of period that we've got to hold the data. It could be 5 years, could be 7 years, right? We have to determine how long do we have to keep this data. And then we need not only to hold the data as long as necessary, but we don't want to be keeping the data forever, right? Because the longer we keep that data, the more risk comes with that. Maybe there's sensitivity to it. But the more data that we have, obviously, the more that we've got to spend resources to track it, to manage it. And of course, the risk becomes higher. So we've got to make sure that we've got to then either, if it comes to that period of that 7 years that we've got to retain it, then we've got to destroy that data securely and safely, right? So ultimately knowing how long we should be keeping our data, and then it becomes the person within the organization who then is basically that data owner, like we mentioned before. Then they become the proper person that's going to go away and obviously ensure that we're destroying that data when the time comes that we have to then obviously give up a retention. So they're the four kind of areas around our data considerations. I'm going to jump into the other component here around the types of data, and we'll talk about that quickly, and then we'll jump into finally data removal sort of best practices and stuff like that. So let's look at the types of data in our environment. So data classifications of data basically becomes, obviously the organization has its data. There's different sort of industry standards and data controls and classifications that we have to obviously adhere to sometimes, right? We've got compliance and regulations. So we've got some sort of things like health data that we have to adhere to. So if we're holding medical records, patient records, or anything it tends to do with our health, right? So if we, got to go take a blood test, and that's our medical details, right? So there's different acts, like you may have heard of HIPAA. That's a double A. So HIPAA has been around for many years, similar to our Privacy Act of 1988 here in Australia, which is the HIPAA equivalent. And this is everything to do with our patient records and personal health data. So HIPAA is something just to be aware of. I'm not going to sort of talk into it too much around this sort of phase, but I just sort of mention it so you know it's available and it's there. Then we have something like our financial information. So the Financial Information Act, information, and this is typically anything to do, obviously, as we're dealing with customers. So typically something like the GLB. I'll just write this out. GLBA. So you can obviously look this up yourself, understand a little bit about it. This is the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and this is basically dealing with financial institutions. If we have, or if we're dealing with financial information of our customers and stuff like that, and we typically have to label that data as sensitive, and that's all it is. It's anytime we deal with our customers' financial information, we have to deem that as highly sensitive. And then obviously we need to protect that data because it's private. So we have to abide by the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, obviously to ensure that the sensitivity to it, right? So that's that thing. The other component is obviously our intellectual property. So we have things like patents, um, maybe the secret source in our pasta sauce, and IP is basically that intellectual property, right? What makes that data unique, or what makes that entity unique to that company. Could be an invention, a design, some sort of pattern, as I mentioned. Basically what drives them, right? What's that secret source? And that IP is always considered private, so we cannot leak it. And that obviously falls into things like espionage. And when I talk about espionage itself, industrial espionage, because and I'll just write the other way around, right? So it's industrial espionage, not espionage. Let me just clean that up. Industrial espionage, because people are going after organizations and they're targeting their intellectual property because they want to determine and find out what that secret sources are, right? So um, obviously we want to protect the business against that, and obviously intellectual property is one of those things that we need to be really, really mindful of. The other one here is our PII data, our personally identifiable information, right? So there's things like what makes things unique to us. We've got our driver's license, passport, other files of things of defining who we are, our address, our tax file number, full name, date of birth, things like that. It's our personal identifiable information, and we have to protect that. And uh, basically all that thing that protects the identity of people, right? Both through our organization, we're all people, and we have to protect that data. And NIST have come out with obviously their own special publication. So NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they put out basically special publications. So if I just write it out here, and they have a special publication which is called the 800, I think it's the 122, which basically the 800 TAC 122 basically looks at the guide to protecting the confidentiality of personable identifiable information. So that looks after the PII component, and you can look at that guide, and it sort of tells you how we go about securing and making sure that the confidentiality between our personal identifiable information. Try saying that 5 times too quick. And they go away and they do that. So you can look that up yourself. Go look at the SP 800 TAC 122, and it sort of dives into best practices and guidance around how we secure that data and keep it confidential and private, which we should at all times, right? All right, so that's pretty much it in terms of our types of data. And finally, data removal, which is our very delicate component, right? There's key aspects to data privacy, right? So we've got things like our GDPR, which looks at things like if we're dealing with, so GDPR is basically the General Data Protection Regulation, and basically protects European citizens of the data and privacy. So basically saying that as we sort of work with, or anyone that deals with the European citizens, the data can be collected and used and provided a way where we can securely remove the data. So if we choose to have that deleted or removed from once that data is collected and how it's used. So it allows people to pretty much give back and obviously define if people don't want to use their data or have it anymore, well, then you have the right to remove it. So you can request, or obviously follow those GDPR guidelines that you can remove that data. So we can go away and do that. We can request that data to be removed. If it's collected for whatever reason, then they have that right to obviously request. Let's put here, request for removal. So we have to just be mindful that there's a law here that there's obviously very strict fines as well if people don't adhere to these policies and the guidelines with that. So there's just something that we need to be aware of as we're sort of going through our removal of our data, right? So when we subscribe to things and when we're dealing with, citizens and stuff like that, with people in our privacy, well, then we have the right to request our information be removed and obviously securely removed, right? So when it comes to sanitization and obviously destroying that data, so we have to do that obviously in a secure manner. So how do we do that? So there's a couple of methods. One is the data has to be overridden with ones and zeros. So when we start talking about, so I'll just put ones and zeros. And what this basically says is within an operating system, right? So we have an OS. And within the OS, there's something called the MFT. And I've spoken about the MFT in a private video. Basically, this is the master file table. And the MFT basically lists out files that are created on the device along with the location of that data. So if I've got a hard drive here and I write some data, it'll basically tell me in the MFTs over here, whatever, and it'll basically tell me that that data is stored at a specific location, right? That's the whole point of the MFT table. So if I go away and delete that data, the data gets written to the actual MFT table, right? So uh, it's basically still stored on the hard drive. So the data is just still will be located on that hard drive. So if we delete the file, delete the data, go into the trash can, remove it, erase it, the reference of that data is still there. So the operating system itself doesn't know about it, right? So we've got to obviously properly destroy it. So when we erase or when we work with the MFT, we have to go in there and obviously erase that data. When we do that by overriding that MFT table with the actual ones and zeros, so it becomes overridden, and then obviously the files and the data cannot be recovered. Hence, obviously that MFT file. So once we've done that, the data becomes sanitized and properly destroyed. So we have to just be mindful that we've got to secure it correctly, destroy it correctly, and that's how we do it with obviously using the ones and zeros in the override of that MFT function. So the master file table. And that covers the sort of this series. We've spoken a little bit about the data removal process, our GDPR laws that we have to be mindful of, obviously destroying the data, being mindful of this MFT table, destroying that correctly. And then obviously the different types of data that exist. So obviously we've got our health data, this financial information that we're dealing with institutions, intellectual property, we're spoken about PII data, and then obviously data considerations that we need to factor in and obviously know where our data is at all times through data sovereignty, because it will affect the location that data resides in. Obviously the ownership, tag in the right ownership within the organization, make sure our contracts are done correctly to say that we own the data. We assign a data custodian within the business who has the right to manage and detail how we go away and define our data and obviously own that data platform itself. Obviously our retention policies, what they look like, and obviously finally our classifications. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If there's anything else that you'd like to see around data retention, I'd love to hear about it. And as always, I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you for watching and bye for now.